Hello everybody. My name is John Coleman. I normally deliver this talk with one of my colleagues, Nader Talai. He might be here later on, but we gave the talk together actually at Agile in the city last week. I currently work as a kind of consultant, if you like, a coach, a trainer at the same time. Currently at Barclaycard as an independent consultant. I do work for Ericsson Broadcasting Media Services and a training company in Northern Ireland as well. So I do half consulting, coaching, half training, if that makes sense. So I've been doing this for a while, as you can tell from the grey hairs in my head. And myself and Nader have been, it's interesting that we only met each other in, I think it was the end of April earlier this year. But we found that there was a lot of commonality between what we were doing. We were coming at this from different angles. Nader actually had some results from previous transformations that he was involved in, and he demonstrated that he had a reduction in the overall time from 404 days down to 91 days. He had a number of case studies behind him, and I had a number behind me as well, and I'll go through more of those later on. So there's a bit of reality to this. This isn't just all theory. We've actually noticed that we can actually get results with this, and we haven't had any early failures yet. It's really difficult to say that the model that we're going to be talking about this evening, the toolkit, whether it's going to give you any kind of success. We can just tell you some of the things that we've tried. A lot of these transformations are 3 to 5 year journeys, and some of these ideas that we're talking about this evening have only been around since 2012. So we're starting to see some results, but we haven't seen any early failures yet. So I'm going to use this metaphor. If you're familiar with the game of chess, when the pawn goes onto the 8th rank, you can get promoted to any piece on the chessboard. And I used to think that it should always promote it to the queen, but you can also, for example, promote it to the knight if you want to go checkmate and all that kind of thing. And what we're trying to get across here is we have a very understated approach to transformation. So something really, really simple. We all talk about push models, and what I want to talk to you about this evening is a pull type model. A lot of organizations have change fatigue. How can we actually generate some pull? How can we get those pawns to move across the board and convert into really powerful pieces where you really get some power from your transformation? Personally, I've done a lot of work in oil and gas. I was the enterprise Agile and Change Coach for Shell, the oil company. And as Steve said earlier, I've worked in some other companies as well, British Gas and so on. So we've been doing this for a while, supply chain, telecoms, a number of different sectors, and we've found similar successes. So it was really, really, really interesting when myself and Nader met, how much commonality there was between the two models. And actually what we've done is we've actually merged the two of them together. You're probably familiar with this one. And I got a little bit tired of this. One company after another, you're not doing Scrum right, you're not doing Kanban right, you're not using the right scaling model, just push it out, here's the operating model, but no real effort to bring the people on a journey. We do know that transformations, are multifaceted, and you need to think of portfolio management and all technical aspects, but culture and leadership, or people, just bringing people on a journey is something that's often overlooked, and we get told, we want to be agile, and I guess what Nader and myself both say is, why do you want that, or what are you trying to achieve out of this? Are you just doing it for the sake of doing it, or are you trying to deliver value early? Are you trying to be more customer focused? Are you trying to innovate? Why are you doing this? Are you doing it because you're being told to do it? And so the reason we've been saying this is because, and you're probably familiar with this yourselves, I know over a number of years I've seen superficial success. I've seen the post-its. I've even seen the meetings, planning meetings. And Andy Carmichael there in the audience, remember he was with me in British Gas as well. Very inconsistent planning. You could have 23 Scrum teams all clicking into each other before we had SAFe and all that kind of stuff. And God love us, we were using scrums, and you saw lots of signs that we were trying to be agile, but really nothing had changed. We were asking the same questions. When will it be done? And if truth be told, lots of water scrum fall going on as well. And that's something that I was very conscious that I was trying to avoid. In my own personal experience, 95% of the scrum that I'm seeing in the UK is not what would have been originally intended, and we're seeing a lot of big design up front, no real effort to deliver value early, lots of fake sprints. We know about the iron triangle, all that kind of good stuff, mixing oil and water basically. So I have a philosophy that I prefer to see people implementing some kind of a method and doing that reasonably well, or something that works well. It's okay, you don't have to be dogmatic, but not losing sight of the, our soul, keeping with the true value of agility. So what myself and Nader are talking about a lot is, how do we actually get real success as opposed to superficial success, where really we're not managing our risk earlier or delivering value earlier. And so, when we say we're doing Agile, so what? Why are we actually doing that? And is the purpose of this transformation Agile, or is it something a bit different? Myself and Nader have stopped talking about Agile transformations as such. We try to focus more on business agility type transformation, where we're focusing on the business, trying to deliver value, trying to be more customer focused on whatever their purpose is. We need to figure out what that purpose is, but Agile might be the means to the end, but it's not actually the end in itself, if that makes sense. So the question we like to ask is, are we actually serving our customers any better? Are we trying to learn faster? Are we trying to deliver faster? Are we trying to get into innovation? And I don't want to make a false dichotomy here. In fact, there could be a number of different angles. I mean, no matter which way you go, there's going to be some change. It'll either happen to you, or you'll try to have some influence over it. So when we do have some kind of transformation, what is it that we're actually looking for? I mean, this all looks fantastic to me. I'd like to deliver faster, maybe manage my risk earlier as well, be more focused with the customer, do lots of discovery stuff trending now, lean UX and all that kind of good stuff. Or maybe having safe-to-fail experiments where we're actually, developing maybe fake product lean startup style or some other kind of technique where we're effectively able to run some kind of probe, figure out whether there's some value in doing any more work in that area. And that's all fine. But we've come across a technique from the Boston Consulting Group called the DICE score. You've probably heard of it. It's they tested this on 225 companies initially, and then they subsequently post-tested it on 3,000 other companies, not necessarily companies, organizations. And they asked 5 very simple questions. How soon will we learn whether this transformation is going in the right direction or not? So apparently short projects where we don't learn that early are more risky than longer projects where we actually try to reflect regularly on how well we're doing. So if we have some kind of formal change governance in place to check, are we heading closer to our target? Well, that would be the duration of the first learning milestone. There's a double weighting though for the next 2. The first of the next 2 is the team performance integrity. So what's the skill level for this team? Are they up to delivering this change? If it's business agility, how much strength do they have in delivering that kind of a change? And so there's various ratings for that. It's got a double weighting because it's really important. How committed are the senior leaders? Apparently, if senior leaders think they have over-communicated the change 3 times, they might just have communicated the change enough to the people on the ground who are affected by the change. The leaders need to be seen to be leading by example, demonstrating the behaviors, asking the right questions. So again, a double weighting for that. And it's not uncommon for me to get a reading of seem to want success when I ask that question, as opposed to clearly explain the need, which is like really resolute, yeah, absolutely explaining how important this is. We also have the commitment of the people who are affected by this change. So are they bought into this? I'm reading a book, Fearless Ownership at the moment, and it's really interesting what the Navy SEALs are doing. When they give out an order, and when the order seems a little bit ridiculous, what they do is they challenge the why. Why are we actually doing this? If the people on the ground understand why we're doing it, they might actually follow through on that. And so how good a job have we done that? And also the effort, how much additional effort do we think that the people affected by this change, people who need to implement this change, how much additional effort do they actually have to put in to make this change stick? I don't mean how much change are they likely to put in, but actually how much is needed for it to stick. And the range is, there's an assumption there's going to be more effort. Over time, we would hope there would be no additional effort because we have some techniques about the change being the work, but initially you do need some kind of change effort. And so less than 10%, 10 to 20, 20 to 40, over 40%. And so you get the idea, we're all 100% occupied most of the time anyway, sometimes 110%. So if you add like 20% on that, it really makes the change a bit difficult. So the question is, do you want this, where the initiative is likely to be complete disaster, or do you want that? It's a big difference, right? So complete disaster or likely success. Changes have a very high failure rate. I mean, you probably all know this. The last 40 years, the numbers haven't changed that much. Roughly 70% failure rate, 19% average for culture change success. So would you actually start on a footing where you know you're not set up for success? You would probably try to start on a good footing. And so what we say is, when you're back here and when you're saying, well, I want all this, please, well, you're probably better off saying, you know what, maybe it's going to take a couple of steps to get there. Let's aim for something that we can achieve right now. Let's try and delimit the change, put a perimeter fence around it so that, in this particular area, if you actually run the change in this area, we're likely to have some success. Then hopefully we can generate some pull later and go on to the next stage. So we highly recommend that people do this. Boston Consulting Group do as well. There's lots of data behind this. You might be wondering about the axes. I'll go into that later. But at the bottom, you've got likely win, likely worry, likely woe. If it's deep into the red zone, it's not a good thing. I have had some changes whether in the amber zone, and you can do some risk management. It's not about necessarily just limiting the change. Okay, so in terms of this axis here, the vertical axis, how do we get to that? Because of the 225 projects that they had, they plotted how successful they were depending on where they were here, and so that's how we got the number on the vertical axis. So I talked about multiple efforts at the change. I had a change even last week where I was giving something that really was, quite frankly, a 5 to 10 year goal, and I said, well, can you give me something kind of in the interim? Because right now, when we run the dice on that, it's like deep into the red zone. Can you give me something short term, something that we can actually do in the next 1 to 2 years? And the reason I say that, I'm kind of using a metaphor there of the light with the kind of J curves. If you're familiar with this, you've got, how likely is it the change is going to be successful, the initial perception of how likely the change is going to be successful versus, what additional effort you need to put in order to do that. Change does need management. So when people do have a long-term goal, it's good to set your sight on that. We don't want to forget that, we want to be this wonderful organization doing all sorts of wonderful things, but we should take one goal at a time, deliver on that, and then pull on the next one, and so on and so forth. So we have a number of metrics based on that. We've already looked at the DICE score. So the DICE score comes from a paper called The Hard Side of Change Management, so 5 very hard questions. But there are also some soft measures as well. One of these is a very popular one from ProC, ADCAR. How aware are you of the change? How much desire do you have for the change? How much knowledge do you have and skills? How much ability do you have to deliver on that? And the key one, do you feel that there's enough reinforcements in place for this change to stick? You've got a trust quotient here as well. I know a sales guy. I was giving a training course there 2 weeks ago, and a sales guy was in the audience. And he actually used that to sell shares. I didn't even know about trust quotient until a number of months ago. But we've been using that. We find that very good because trust and ownership, there's also an ownership quotient. They're key measures. When you're measuring culture, it's a soft thing. You can't kind of just pick one number and say we're here, we're there. There's a number of different lenses. And that would be one of them. How much do we trust each other? How much do the leaders trust us? How much do we trust them? And the OKAI competing values over here. So where are we right now, which is down the hierarchical zone, and where do we want to be, up in the entrepreneurial zone? So people can answer questions based on that. So we do try to capture not just how ready we are for the change, but as we progress, how are we doing against that change? Are any of these needles moving to help us with that? So if any of you have come across Frederic Laloux's work on reinventing organizations, he's got a few interesting diagrams. And a guy called Morgan had previous metaphors before, but this is kind of a more modern, trendy version. And you can see it's kind of got a Russian doll type approach. So, you've got different levels. And so at the very, very bottom, you've got like a fear type culture. The wolf pack would be the metaphor for that, where there's fear in terms of how we do things. There would always be a little bit of that in an organization. And then you've got, in terms of, military, we tell you what to do and we tell you how to do it. Then into kind of the more modern kind of matrix organization, competitive organization, where we tell you what to do, but we give you flexibility on how to do it. And then you got the likes of the Googles and the Apples and Facebooks of the world, and, the kind of the green zone here. It's kind of blown up a bit more. Shared values, engagement, delight the customers, all that kind of good stuff. And there's a few companies in the teal zone, which is, you can see some, they don't actually have a label for it yet, but you can see one of the words there, anti-fragile, resilient, no strategy, no budgets, no targets. This is an organization called Buurtzorg, the Netherlands, that supplies nurses to elderly people and people who need home help. And previously, there was an organization there. In 2 years, they've managed to get 80% of the business in the country. What used to happen before is, let's say, you all were taking medicine, but there was a particular way that you took your medicine, and there was, you had particular quirks. What would happen with the previous organization that would send the nurses out, you could get any nurse. It could be me, it could be somebody else, and they don't care, they don't have time, just take your tablets, yeah? Whereas what Buurtzorg do is they assign 2 nurses to each patient. They have cups of tea with them. They understand what the need is of the patient and all that kind of good stuff. But these people are taught to work without bosses, to be able to be truly self-managing. So these organizations are starting to exist. So you see the different colors. The staircase is a little bit of an oversimplification. The Russian doll kind of does a little bit better. Where are you in terms of maturity? I mean, there's other ones previous to that as well in history. But, this has been the kind of evolution of organizational design and structure and control, particularly over the last 100 years. And so we are seeing a big progression from here into the green zone and so on. So why is this relevant? Why am I talking about this? The reason I'm talking about it is because, particularly when I was in Shell, there was 4 or 5 different lines of business, and they all had their own different culture, actually. And even within different portfolios, within those areas, there were different cultures. So what I noticed was the approach that I took to change had to adapt to the type of metaphor that they were in. I was previously using Morgan's metaphors of machine, organism, all that kind of thing, kind of similar kind of idea. So here, wolf pack, military at peacetime. You've got, the machine model here, and then you're kind of getting into the more family type metaphor, and teal kind of anti-fragile. So why is that relevant? The reason it's relevant is because we think, and we've demonstrated this actually through a number of case studies, that you need to use a different change approach depending on the type of organization you're dealing with. It could even be a subsection of the organization that you're within. If you go in to try and do a little bit of change evolution, Kanban probes or lean startup or even running Scrum to kind of go through some experiments to gradually change the organization, you might need a little bit of more energy than that. If you were down here in the competitive military peacetime kind of wolf pack type zones, you might need a little bit more than that. Sometimes there's a need for making people uncomfortable. If you go in and say, well, we'll only take you as far as you're willing to go, but actually where we're willing to go is actually not far enough to make a material change in terms of reaching our vision, we sometimes need to actually go a little bit further than that. And so what am I talking about here? Why would you use these approaches, and what's the difference between this and this and this? So I can tell you a few stories. I can tell you that there was one organization where I recommended tipping point leadership. And tipping point leadership came out of one of the top 10 reviews on change management, the Harvard Business Review. And Bill Bratton, a guy in NYPD, He's been brought back again since, actually, but I remember being chased off Times Square in 1994. There was a big crime problem there. Went back subsequently in the 2000s, and it was all cleaned up. And he's kind of famous for cleaning up a number of police forces. I think he actually helped a couple of police forces here in the UK. And actually one of the patterns that you'll notice, which I'll refer to later on, it's no common in the UK. But what he did was, he didn't bother trying to convince his people that change was needed. He motivated them to change. So, this is like where it was really difficult, people understood that there was a problem, but still, in terms of actually getting them to do something about it was a different story. And he felt he didn't have time. Also, he didn't have the money to make any change. And so what he did was, the first thing that he did was he got the precinct commissioners to use the subway because they were all getting limos into work or whatever. And so straight away they could see that people were jumping over gates. There was lots of theft, all that kind of good stuff. And so now the precinct commissioners at least understood what the problem was. They said, okay, we see there's a problem. But he still didn't manage to get them to actually do anything about that. So what he did then was, if you can imagine the setting inside here, he would bring everybody in, and effectively, one at a time, everybody would present their crime figures for that precinct. And I couldn't blame you, and you couldn't blame me, because we're all here, and you'll be presenting your figures soon. So effectively what he did was he put peer pressure on the precinct commissioners to deliver on improving the crime figures. And he did so without even convincing them. He motivated them by creating some competition, and by knocking over the kingpins, that then motivated the rest of the organization. So that's something really radical. You could argue there's some complexity theory in there as well, but it's where you effectively use command and control to roll out something like business agility, which sounds really paradoxical. From an agile point of view, it sounds really, really strange. From a change point of view, it makes a lot more sense. And like I say, I've only ever recommended it once. You have to be in a really difficult environment. Using Morgan's metaphor, the two metaphors that I had were psychic prison and instrument of domination. So you kind of get the idea that it wasn't a very nice environment, okay? But they were in a place where they were doing a lot of really bad water scrum fall. The most typical pattern that we would recommend would be to try and get some initial energy behind the change. So if you've read Our Iceberg is Melting, and the little fable from John Cotter, a lot of you probably read that already, and he's written loads of books on change. Little Freddie goes under the iceberg, he sees a big hole, he sees a cave, he understands it's summertime, and in the wintertime the new ice is going to break the old ice, and he knows there's the problem, and he goes up and he convinces Alice, kind of second in command in the colony, to convince the colony leaders to understand the problem. And in fairness, the head of the colony said, Fred, fill the bottle with water, put a cork on top, we come back in the morning, if the bottle is broken, we know we've got a problem. So when we talk about change leadership, we often say, where's our broken bottle? What is the thing, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? And that's great, but what I also discovered was that the leaders who come together telling me that this is the problem or whatever it is, often they, if to use Jeff Patton's analogy of circle, square, triangle, I'm glad we all agree, but we're all thinking of different things. And so I understood actually that, number one, I was only getting really passive support for the change. Change leadership is all about, getting powerful guiding coalition, let's create a vision, empower the team, go for early wins, all that kind of good stuff. And even if you get all of that, we lose a lot of energy after 4 or 5 months. But what I noticed was there was kind of passive support. What I also noticed was that I had viral contagion of bad agility, if I can call it that. I don't want to say good, bad, but there weren't good patterns, let's put it that way, in one business unit, one company that I was working in. And so even when I was joining the likes of a bit of change leadership, what's our broken bottle, what's our vision, blah, 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 and then running experiments after that with all sorts of fancy lean startup, all that kind of good stuff, that was great, but I was getting a viral contagion of the wrong thing. So the trick that I was missing was behaviors. And that's what I That's when I realized actually that there aren't just two schools of thought, where John Cotter says change must be led, and Peter Senge, strategic thinker of the 20th century, says change cannot be led, it must evolve. And it's kind of saying, okay, thanks guys, that's brilliant. You're saying the opposite to each other. You're both geniuses, but how does that help me? So I said, okay, we'll put the two of them together, do leadership first, and then we'll evolve later. So depending where you're on the timeline, you're going to be okay. But behaviors was still a problem. And that's when I knew I had to do a look around to see, what can I do? What can I do to make sure that it doesn't just look like a duck and quack like a duck, actually is a duck, as opposed to it not being a duck. This is the problem that I was noticing. Even when I was implementing a change, I wasn't really getting a change in real behaviors. And so what I started looking at was a book called Viral Change and another book, a companion book called Homo Imitans, from a guy called Leandro Herrero of the Chalfont Project. This guy, he calls himself an organization architect. He was previously a psychologist. He was an MD. Then he was like a top exec in a number of pharma type companies. And then he set up this Chalfont Project because he noticed that he was making a difference. And you can see again the metaphors are being mixed here, but effectively what he's saying is you can get a small number of people to make significant change. In fact, the people who are most connected can actually do quite a lot. Please take a seat. And so the only catch, I guess, with viral change is that it's trademarked. You need to use one of the viral change companies to actually implement viral change. It is licensed. You have to use one of their accredited people. I'm not one of those people myself. But I am in regular contact with Leandro about this. And so it is trademarked. So you just need to be a bit careful about that. But there are some very good patterns in there. And so one of the things I try to do is effectively ask key influencers for help. I don't volunteer people. I try to find out who the key influencers are, and they're not necessarily people on the formal organization. They could be people who are actually informal. Maybe a developer, a UX designer, someone in marketing. When they say something, people's heads turn. They listen, they imitate them, they respect them. These are the kind of people that we actually want to ask for help. And when you ask people for help, it's really, really powerful because now they're kind of driving this themselves. And the next thing you need to do is you need to negotiate. It's a bit of a paradox. Negotiate non-negotiable behaviors. It sounds really strange. What am I talking about? So I've run a number of exercises. I'm going to show you some examples shortly. But if say we're going to do some change, and let's say we've decided our purpose. Let's say the purpose of our change is to be more customer focused, and we want to implement some business agility techniques to help us with that. So I would even leave that out and say, do we need to change? And if everybody says, yeah, we need to change, and we understand why we're doing it, and we understand, okay, that's fine. Can you try to personify the change now? Can you come up with some behaviors that exemplify that change? And appreciating that we will all have different opinions on that. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all of that out into the wash. Because remember I talked about leaders earlier. We change leadership. We have leaders, you think circle, you think square, I think triangle. I'm glad we all agree. We're trying to get away from that. We're trying to get the examples of the behaviors out on the table so we can actually have a negotiation about it. And so once we do that, we can then accumulate some stories. The key trick really would be, there's a few of them, it has to start with the word I, because I am the change. This change starts with me. A lot of changes struggle because people are thinking, so-and-so needs to do something, somebody else needs to do something, and so on. But the change actually starts with me. So when you write the behaviors, I do this, I do that. And other little tricks, like you don't say, I need to do this and I need to do that, because they're like shoulds, they're like wishes. You're like wishing that something will happen. You're annoying yourself. No, it's I will do this, or I do this. It's really definite, and something practical as well. Not something aspirational, something really practical that you actually do that would actually personify that change. And the other little trick is And according to Leandro, he says, your PhD in psychology is this: those behaviors which you give attention to will prosper, and those that you don't give any attention to will fade away. So what you try to do is you try not to say, don't do this and don't do that. Don't walk on the grass. Don't smoke here. We appreciate when you don't abuse our staff. And what do you think happens when you say, what do you think happens when you say, we appreciate when you don't abuse our staff in NHS counters? What do you think actually happens? Any ideas? Yeah.
Think about when you say don't do something, not my children, they'll think about actually that don't fall over, and they'll think about falling over.
Yeah. It's like when I was ice skating yesterday, I was thinking about falling, and then I was stopped thinking about falling, because you know you're thinking about falling. You hear about caddies getting fired in golf when someone says to the golfer, watch the lake there, and of course now you're thinking about the lake and the ball's going to go into the lake, right? So we try to make sure that there are some positive behaviors. We try to convert anything negative into a positive where we can, and we make up some stories, and the stories are important because they need to be memorable. And they need to be for people like me, not heroic stuff where we just annoy people. Because we're actually going to use the social networks, and I don't mean Facebook and Twitter. I mean people actually talking to each other in the company, because these stories will then spread. Leandro uses a metaphor. He says, I hate the metaphor, but it's memorable. He says, you have a mountain, you light fires in the mountain, you don't know which one is going to take off, make the mountain go completely up in fire. And with viral change, you just don't know. You're trying to create a social infection. We're trying to create a social infection of these behaviors, these stories, and we're trying to emphasize those. So here's some examples. This is one that I did last week, actually. In this particular case, and it's hard to read them, of course, but the first thing I did was, what are the levels of dissatisfaction internally and externally? What's the drivers for any change here? And then what I did, it's kind of difficult to read, but I will zoom in a minute. So what are your non-negotiable behaviors? And normally I would take quite a few hours, but this was just during a Kanban training course, actually, because there were some issues about, implementing this. And so I said, what are the behaviors? The colors don't mean anything. There were just all sorts of different suggestions. We did basic dot voting to kind of narrow it down. We did 3 levels of filtering to actually figure out what those behaviors might be. And then we write stories to support those as well. So it's kind of difficult to read this one here, but I'm going to try and do it from memory. So Jenny and Paul send Ruby, their well-trained dog, to collect the newspaper from the shop. He appears a few days later, really thin and tired looking. Jenny and Paul had moved house and had forgotten to retrain the dog on where the new local shop was. And so there's a moral associated with that as well. So these stories aren't necessarily to do with work, just something memorable to remember what the behaviors were.
What was the behavior for that one?
It's kind of hard to read, I think. I will ensure all stakeholders are kept fully updated on, I can't read the rest of it. Something to do with delivery. I think I've got a better one later on. Here's another, this is a really interesting one. I'll be firm with the client when they tried to shortcut processes. Because they had an example where it was a kind of regular behavior with the client that, even though as a supplier they had particular standards, the client was actually damaging itself by cutting quality sometimes. And this was, they came up with a behavior supporting that as well. And that was actually one of their top ones. There's another one about a bike shop as well. They had a bit of fun doing this, actually. And the penny didn't really drop until they actually wrote the stories to support the behaviors. Here's some more examples. So I can't read this. I will complete my manager and HR responsibilities. I will explain why I need next done by Y date. So a lot of it about communications as well. And so what's really powerful about this, and maybe not the way it was originally intended by Leandro Herrero, but when we talked earlier about, that vision, what I find is if I get the key people in a room to come up with the behaviors that exemplify the change, then we actually get a common understanding of what the change is. Almost every time I do this exercise, people come into the room thinking that the change is X, Y, Z, and they ends up being ABC. And they had no idea that it was something different. So if nothing else, what you do, even if you don't do anything else with viral change, you can get alignment on what the vision is, what are we actually trying to achieve here. And that's the really powerful piece of it. Here's some other examples. A man rings a bike shop to inquire about a Harley Davidson. The shop only sells push bikes. So we had lots of examples of where the client was asking for stuff that actually wasn't available. They were still trying to deliver them. We had another behaviour was to do with communications because there was one particular requirement. It was for broadcasting, and there was a £90,000 fine if you were down for a number of minutes. But also there was a particular change that was going through the system, and nobody really gave it priority. Nobody understood why it was so important. And eventually, towards the end, they discovered there was a £100,000 fine if they didn't deliver that particular requirement. So they had some behaviours about being really clear about why we actually need these requirements, and that there were the particular problems that they had. This is another one that I did last week as well. And we use dot voting again. I try not to rush the dot voting because I like to kind of, sometimes what we find is the wording isn't quite right. We need to kind of tune it a little bit. Here's some examples. I will collaborate. Would others have the skills that I don't have? I will collaborate across teams and functions. I can't read that one there. I will focus on value delivery outcomes. I'll promote transparency through release of value, early release of value. So when I was trying to figure out what the change was in a number of different cases, I was able to use this technique to figure out what they're really, really looking for. It's another example I did last year. This team really struggled to start it with the word I. They were pointing the finger at other people. I had to run it a few times before they actually got a behaviour that was actually to do with themselves. And what was really interesting was, in this particular case, a digital agency in Holland, and they brought me in originally actually because they wanted to roll out Scrum. And they were really clear about that. They want to roll out Scrum, and that was it. And I said, okay, hang on a second. Okay, what kind of problems are you trying to solve? So we, the usual kind of 6 thinking hats, all this kind of stuff. Kind of set the scene, ran the behavior session, nailed it down to these top 5, and you can pull out the top 3 there if you want as well. You can see I do product backlog refinement, look ahead for 2 to 3 months. I participate in product backlog refinement to get ready stories. I am clear on my roles and responsibilities and where I fit in the process. I feel safe and free to escalate, and I do it. And I make issues and risks visible and re-escalate if necessary. I regularly reforecast with my peers. So plans remain credible. So they're all kind of very good type of behaviors. And sometimes actually when I go in, when I'm asked to do, particularly if it's a business agility type of transformation, sometimes I'm very uncomfortable with the behaviors that they've actually selected. Because if I put on my Agile hat, I might look at it and say, oh, actually, why didn't they, if they're going to go with Scrum or if they're going to go with this or that, why didn't they pick those behaviors? Because actually, we haven't a snowball's chance of hell of that thing working unless they actually pick those. But are you not better off when you know actually what behaviors they really will follow? And in this particular case, we then were able to have a kind of a method, I won't call it a method fit discussion, because that would be too dogmatic on the Agile methods. But we were certainly able to put a behavioral lens on the various options that they were considering. And then we presented the options, and how do they tie in with the various behaviors, dot voting, all that kind of stuff. And so in that particular case, they ended up implementing Kanban on top of design thinking for discovery, because there was a digital agency. They're really, really good at going out and talking to potential users and seeing what could happen. They're really, really good at that. In fact, the client had been behaving badly and had been telling them exactly how to do the UI UX. And so the whole thing that they were offering was effectively being diluted. So they're really, really comfortable to kind of go back to that. And then they decided to use Kanban on top of what they were doing already, which was kind of waterfall. So Kanban on top of waterfall, and then to take an evolutionary journey away from there to eventually get to whatever place that's going to be. So in that particular case, they needed to be responsive, they needed to deliver early, They needed to have credible plans. They went through the behavioural journey to figure out, okay, what are we actually really believing? Because when we get to periods of stress, what we don't want is to give lip service to say we're going to do this and we're going to do that. This is actually what they really will support. At least this is what they said they would support, and you can retune that as well every so often. You can use the other hard and soft metrics to double check on that. So the challenge then, as you know, the challenge is from the inside out, but also from the outside in. And what we need to be careful about is, and here's a few quotes: in times of change, the learners will inherit the earth, while the learners find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. So we must remember what are we actually focusing on, why are we actually trying to achieve it. We need to try to embed the change in the actual work itself. We need to try and embrace uncertainty. We need to be trying to act small, still think big, but learning fast. And so these are the challenges that we have, but the behavioural blend helps to understand, which approach we might use, which is more compatible with our organisation. So try and read this aloud in your own mind. You might have seen this before. You knew it wasn't those words anyway, didn't you? And we need to come up with better examples, because they're not real words either, but you get the idea. Our brain fills in the gaps. So declarations of high confidence mainly tell you that an individual has constructed a coherent story in his or her mind, not necessarily that the story is true. And this guy got a Nobel Prize for his thinking. And what we need to do is we need to be certain about our uncertainty. So one of the big problems that we have is we need this grand plan. So when we're looking for business agility, that's great. You've got your viral change, you've run your exercise, this is what we're supporting. Now we're going forward, we're running some experiments, we have our transformation backlog, we have our story map, we're going through that, but we still look for the plan. And actually what we need to be able to embrace the uncertainty. We don't always believe what we see what we believe in. So we don't necessarily spot the obvious, because actually we have particular conditioning about what we're actually looking for. I'll give you an example. When I was working Barclaycard in Northampton, they cut down the trees. I'm not sure if you remember that, Steve. I was having a conversation with someone, and the trees were gone. And I was like, I couldn't concentrate on what the person was saying because the trees were gone. I just couldn't deal with it. So it kind of affected the way I was thinking. So it's funny how we can be conditioned like that. I think we're all familiar with this story. Don't need to say much more about this one. So the thing is, and this is something I was saying back in 2012, and Jack Welch has been saying for a long time, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, then the end is near. And so what we're trying to do is, how do we deal with that? So what are our attributes right now? So for example, we've been delivering successful change for the last 15 years. We know what customers want and serve them well. It takes 35 days to raise a purchase order, which can be seen as a bad thing, I guess. We're optimized for utilization, which in my view is a bad thing. It takes forever to get the products we want through the technology. Every time we release something, we suffer from some post-release defects. And that's fine. So you need to recognize where you are. So if you want to go somewhere, where are we right now? And let's be really honest about that. And then we need to say, well, where are we going to go? And remember the DICE score that we talked about earlier on. If we have a long-term goal, we might need to take a number of J curves to get there, a number of transformations to get there. So what's our initial goal that we're going to go for the next 1 to 2 years, maybe 3 years max? So here's some examples. People doing the work can change how they do it. Managers and coaches, managers coach and challenge staff to improve. We solve problems for people. We delight our customers, optimize flow of customer value. All seems fantastic. But how do we get there? And what everybody looks for is a perfect plan that says this is what we're going to do. In February we're going to do this, in March we're going to do that, and you get the idea. It's just ridiculous. So you're probably all familiar with the Cynefin framework. David Snowden, I think he's going to be doing a talk in 2 weeks. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a sense-making framework where he breaks down the problem domains. So disorder is often where we are. We don't realize which domain we're in. and we kind of revert to type basically. So if in a bureaucratic role, I'll think it's a problem to do with bureaucracy. If I'm an engineer, I think it's an engineering problem. I need more time to investigate or I need some help and so on. We have preconditioning in us about how we deal with particular problems. And what David Snowden does beautifully is he talks about, he breaks problems down, ordered and unordered. So ordered, simple and complicated. So simple, you use best practice. Complicated, use good practice, because there might be more than one option available. You usually get an expert in to help you. And then there's complex, where you need emergent practice. If you use best practice actually in the emergent zone, you might be making a mistake actually. In fact, the example that he gives in his videos, which you can see online, is a good practice is to just get all the experts in the room in the desperate hope that someone's going to come up with the right answer. And that's actually a good strategy, is according to him. And this is kind of what we're saying as well. Culture and leadership, this is complex. We cannot say exactly what's going to happen. But what we can do is we can put some indicators on. We can say, what's your blood pressure? What's your temperature? The usual kind of sensors. Except these would be from a cultural leadership and overall transformation point of view. We have our focus. And then, we have some enablers in terms of, what's the purpose, that we need to be really clear on the purpose. So why are we actually doing this? Getting people aligned on that. We can use the behavioral change for that. Engaged leadership, coaches, not necessarily external. We can go into competency framework later, and visualizing the work and where it is. But then what we do is we tackle one obstacle at a time. We can have multiple things going on. You can have multiple experiments, but we're trying to tackle one obstacle at a time. This is coming from Toyota Improvement Kata. And this is where the scouts and the champions come in as well. And so what you're trying to do is, you're trying to get to the sun. You might take a deviant approach to get there, but you tackle one obstacle at a time. And I've run a number of training courses recently. I kept asking people, had anybody seen The Martian? Anybody here seen The Martian? The movie The Martian? And there's a line at the end where he's talking to the astronauts. I won't give it away for everybody else. But if you want to get back from Mars, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to get there, well, but if you just take one problem at a time, one after the other, eventually you get home. And so that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to set up some safe-to-fail probes. Now, we do need to make sure there's safety there. And we have if you try something and we fail, and it's like a big disaster because you fail, that's not good. And David Snowden would say you need to have a dampening strategy. When things don't work out well, you agree in advance. If this happens, let's not get people fired and all that kind of good stuff. We learn something and we'll try something different. So we do probes, and we do one after the other, and we use viral change in there to get the behaviors to spread as well. And so we have the behavioral aspect. So we believe there are three schools of thought actually: change leadership. Change evolution, which is where you're going to do one thing after another, trying another thing, and then behavioral change, where actually if you click the three of those together, we believe actually that's I won't say it's the secret sauce because we're talking about it, but it's kind of it's a good formula that we've been using, and we haven't had any early failures yet with that. So some more results. We saw this one earlier on. This is another example that Nader had on a 6-month engagement for a digital service. Failure demand is, effectively defects, rework, doing things the second time when you should have maybe, hopefully, got it done the first time, in terms of, quality. Here's another example as well where the intervention was in terms of finishing stuff. And so instead of, really getting nowhere with lots of stuff, having some kind of predictability in between in there. And you say, wow, what the hell is all of this? So this on a page is what I've been talking about. And it needs a bit of work. It's been around since 2012. Hasn't changed that much since 2012. Where Nader has really helped me is making sure that these are probes as opposed to experiments. Experiments have a hypothesis. You say you're expecting a particular result. And so the experiment fails if you don't deliver on that particular result. Whereas here, we're trying something. We really don't know what's going to happen. We have an idea, but we don't know. All we do know is we learn something. At least we hope we learn something. So viral change is the bit where we get the key influences together. We ask them for help. What are the behaviors? what will you really support? That helps us to get our vision, which drives into the change leadership. So we talked about the broken bottle. So those conversations that this is actually our problem. These are the behaviors that we'll have to support it. We've implicitly got our powerful guiding coalition by getting those key influencers together. That helps us create the vision, all that good stuff. And then we can run different probes after that. Now, there's a practical side to this as well, because it's very theoretical if we just leave it at this. So the next step is, once you've got people in the journey, once people are aligned, why are we doing this? And once people feel actually that they're engaged in the change, that we're not saying, I'll pick any model, here's enterprise services planning, here's large-scale Scrum, whatever it is, here, take that pill. Instead of saying that, what problems are we trying to solve? What behaviors would you support? Okay, what business agility approaches would be compatible with that? How can we scale with those types of approaches? Then you're engaging people. You're not asking them to sign up. You're engaging with them. They're co-designing the change with you. Even if we have some solutions in our back pocket, we're being diplomatic about what we're saying. Because actually they may come up with better answers. But after all of that, when all of that is said and done, with any transformation, there's a lot of tough problems that will need to be solved. Portfolio management, business commitment, financial planning, contracts, rewards, playbooks, controls, method selection guide, scaling guide, agile manager behaviors, organization design, technical enablement, the list goes on. And I try to use a story map to feed a Kanban board, typically using Lean Startup. So why do I have this? This is like the multi-dimensional view of the overall change. And then this is what's going on at the moment. I find this works quite well, actually, of all the tools that we're using. When we use a Kanban system, that's the bit that's getting most energy. But we do put learning time boxes around that, typically using Lean Startup or Scrum, something that has a loop in it, because you need that in the complex zone. You need something with a loop to get early feedback. And that's effectively how we're managing the change. We're pulling, new experiments are coming in here, new ideas are coming in, and moving forward, and that allows us to evolve all the while and help us, hopefully, to get to the end of this J curve and hopefully on to the next one. Just getting back here, so if you're using Kanban, you might want to use the systems thinking approach to implementing Kanban, but there's lots of tools. There's lean change management as well from Jason Little. We're not prescriptive about which tools you use. This is a toolkit. Toolkit means, there's a tools in the box and you pick out which tools suit you. It's not a framework. But when we've combined these together, we haven't had early failures yet. I can't say that this is successful. I can just tell you that we haven't had early failures. I've actually had a contagion in one of my clients at the moment. There's a particular approach actually going like wildfire. It started with one line of business, now it's going into another line of business, and it's just going like wildfire. And we're not quite sure which little fire lit the whole of the organization, but it's happening. And we've used the viral change approach in every training session we did on the various business agility methods to figure out what is it that you would actually support that helps them to accept what tools, what frameworks they can use within the business agility context. Lean change management, if you're not familiar with it, effectively uses experiments. You can use that with a little bit of a tweak if you call that probes from a complexity point of view, but we found in practice actually that's the piece of our board that doesn't have as much energy as the rest. Kanban just seems to keep everybody understands it. That piece seems to be working, but in theory, lean change management looks good, but we just haven't. We're going to try it more, but we're finding most energy from a change story map, feeding a Kanban system with something looping, plan, do, check, act, lean startup, Scrum, whatever you want yourself, iterative even. And those combined, that's what we've been having success with. And that's pretty much it.